So we've seen in the past couple years a tendency of people to fly rear risers on speed wings a lot. And we've seen a few bad habits, and we wanted to make a video to kind of highlight the right and wrong way to fly on the rear risers and give you an idea of why we fly with rear risers, what it's for, and when to use them and when not to use them.
The rear risers are okay to use, but you have to be much more sensitive on them because the speed range that you can go through is much more critical. There's a higher stall speed normally when you're using the rear risers compared to the brakes. So although we understand people use them, we would definitely recommend that you use the brakes more. And if you do use the rear risers, you need to be very sensitive and very careful.
Rear riser flying was inspired by skydiving, swooping canopies. In skydiving, especially when trying to get most distance out of a swoop, it's better to use the rear risers because they create less drag than using the brakes. So they use it to plane out from a swoop, so to come from a diving condition to flat and level flight, to hold as much speed as they can. In speed flying, drag can be a good thing, and especially when you're flying close to terrain and in any amount of turbulence, it's much better to have that little bit of drag with the brake toggles. It's going to make the wing much more stable and much more resistant to collapse being in the brake toggles. So when using the rear risers, it's very important that you realize that they have much less travel. You get much less feel from the wing. So the wing is made to give you a good amount of feedback in the brakes. In the rears, you lose a lot of that. So rears mostly are for smooth conditions, especially when terrain flying. So some of the benefits to using the rear risers flying the terrain, especially when the trimmers are open, it's going to be a much smoother input. One of the things we get when flying these small wings at high speeds is something called adverse roll. So as you start to pull the brake travel, initially that deflection of the trailing edge is going to cause more lift than it creates drag. So it actually rolls the other way before you pull into the brake. So sometimes on very small wings, doing small inputs down a hill, you can start some oscillations. If your trim's open, flying really fast, and you're gentle on your rears, it can be a lot smoother down a line to fly the rear risers than the brakes. When using these smooth inputs and flying the rear risers down a line, you can keep a lot more speed down a run, and the speed translates to safety. If you end up deeper in a line, it will give you more energy to balloon up. Just like in the brakes, if you induce the rears to climb away from an object, it's only temporary. You're going to pull away from the terrain, and eventually the wing is going to recover. It will shoot back forward and it's going to dive again. So you really need to be diligent in picking your lines well, and it's not going to cure all terrain problems. Some of the bad habits we've seen with people flying rear risers is right off of launch. People who want to fly a steep line, immediately after launch, they'll dump the trimmers all the way open and grab onto the risers to start flying on the rear risers. We feel this is a dangerous practice for a few reasons. First off, dumping the trimmers all the way open directly off launch. Right off launch is a lot of times where you will feel turbulence, and you're putting yourself at that lower angle of attack where you're more susceptible to collapse already. And if you reach up and grab the rears, you're putting no brake input to the glider, and you're taking away your feel of that air. So it's very important when transitioning to the rears to do it slowly and smoothly. You want to slowly let those brakes up, let the wing gain full forward flying speed, and be ready to transition into the rears. You do have a little bit of control with the rears to stop collapses, but like I said before, the gliders respond to brake input in turbulence much better. In turbulence, reaction time is paramount. You need to be really quick on stopping a collapse and increasing that angle of attack. When flying in the rears, there's always going to be a little bit of a delay for you to transition from your rears to your brake toggles. If you're already sitting with a little bit of weight in the brake toggles, your reaction time is much less. So it's a much safer idea if there's any turbulence out to just be in the brakes in the first place. Any scenario where your glider is at a low angle of attack, it's much better to be in the brakes. So things like aggressive turns or rolls with the wing, the glider will respond much better with your hands on the brakes than it does to rears. Also, even though the brakes create more drag, they also create more lift. So if you're trying to roll really flat and not lose a lot of altitude in the turn, Rolls are much better done with the trimmers closed and in the brakes, and you'll end up losing a lot less altitude. The use of rear risers is something that can broaden your skill set as a speed flying pilot, but you really want to make sure you're doing it the right way, and you want to learn it high, far away from terrain, and really get comfortable with how your wing reacts to those rear riser inputs before ever doing it close to the ground. And it's very important that you never discount the use of the brake toggles.
For me personally, I think it's a better idea to hold the rear risers very low and just use little movements rather than holding them high and do big movements, because your potential to stall the wing with a big movement is much higher, obviously.
And so it's a good idea to stick your hands up there in the rear risers, and it's more of a pull backwards, just a tweak of the riser, than it is a pull down. Never do you want to be like grabbing high on the rear risers and using them like toggles and pulling them towards you. It's more of just a deflection backwards to put a very small input into the glider. Those main things to watch for when using the rears is you want to be smooth. You don't want to over control the wing on the rears, so you want to restrict your travel, and you want to be really slow on your transition from flying the brakes to flying those rear risers. When opening the trimmers, you want to stay in the brakes for a second, let it slowly go to full flight before grabbing onto those rears and using them to fly. Here at Ozone, we want to make sure that you're using your equipment to its potential, but also that you're staying as safe as possible. We want everybody to be out there flying and having a good time, but really to come back safely. So when learning these things, consult an instructor and learn slowly, learn these techniques high before you take them close to the terrain.